She's building a basket for cows. That was how they said it in town, at the church lot, at the mill line where people waited and talked. Not cruel exactly, just certain. The certainty of people who had seen plenty of settlers try strange things and fail. Owen Bell rode out to see it for himself. He found her driving stakes into frozen ground, her younger brother beside her, both of them working like the calendar was a blade at their throats. When she explained what she planned to do, bend saplings into hoops, weave brush through them, cover the whole thing with straw and mud. He stared at her for a long moment. "You're going to put a basket over your cows," he said. She did not argue. She did not explain. She picked up another stake and drove it into the ground. She had arrived in the lower James River country in August of 1886 with a husband, a younger brother, and 11 head of cattle. By September, she had only the brother and the cattle. Thomas Whitfield left on a Tuesday. He did not say goodbye. He left a note on the table explaining that he had mortgaged next year's calf crop against feed, then lost the money in a grain speculation scheme in town. The note did not say where he was going. It did not say if he was coming back. It said only that he was sorry and that the debt remained. Cora Whitfield stood in the doorway of her half-finished shack and read the note twice. She was 27 years old. She had $31 in cash, a 13-year-old brother named Eli who depended on her, 11 cows and 2 spring calves in a pole-fenced lot, and a winter coming that everyone said would be the worst in memory. The shack behind her had no proper siding on the north wall. The cattle lot had no roof, no windbreak, nothing but open fence posts and a sky already turning the color of iron. She could not leave. If she abandoned the claim, she lost the land, the herd, and the 5 years she had already sunk into proving up the place. If she sold the cattle now, at distressed prices, she would have nothing left to build on. If she stayed and did nothing, the animals would freeze in the first hard spell, and the debt would come due just the same. There was no good choice. There was only the choice she made. The first man to tell her she would fail was Angus Vale. Vale rode onto the property 3 days after Thomas disappeared. He was 58 years old, a former trail foreman who had wintered cattle from Montana to Dakota for 18 seasons. He had buried 2 sons and a wife to the cold. When he spoke about winter, people listened because he had paid for every word with something that could not be replaced. Cora had sent word asking what it would take to winter the herd in the standard way. Vale came to look. He did not dismount for the first 10 minutes. He simply sat his horse and turned in a slow circle, taking inventory of everything she had and everything she lacked. "You have half a frame," he said finally, pointing at the shack. "No siding on the north, no proper chinking. That wind comes through. It'll cut like a knife." Cora said nothing. She already knew. Vale swung down from his saddle and walked to the cattle lot. The 11 cows watched him with the dull patience of animals who had not yet learned to be afraid. He counted them, noted their condition, studied the fence posts and the open ground. "You have maybe 2 tons of poor hay," he said. "You need more than double. That stack won't last 6 weeks if weather stays kind, and weather won't stay kind." "I know," Cora said. "You have no team fit to drag full lumber loads. That mare of yours is sound, but she's not a draft horse. You can't haul what you need before the roads turn bad." "I know." Vale turned to face her. His eyes were the color of weathered wood, and they held no cruelty, only the flat certainty of a man who had seen too many people die to waste time on kindness. "You don't build a proper cattle barn on $31, he said. "You don't build it with 1 boy and no hired hand. You don't build it between now and hard freeze. The math doesn't work." Cora felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprise. She had already done the math herself, but hearing it from Angus Vale made it real in a way her own calculations had not. "What would you do?" she asked. Vale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd sell what I could, pay what I owed, and find somewhere else to winter. You're not going to save this herd in an open pen with no shelter and no feed." And if I can't leave? Vale looked at her. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, something that might have been pity, or might have been respect, or might have been nothing more than the recognition of a familiar kind of stubbornness. Then you will hear them bawling under the snow by dawn, he said, and that's if you're lucky. If you're not, you'll hear nothing at all. He mounted his horse and rode away. Cora stood in the empty lot and watched him go. The wind picked up, coming from the northwest, carrying the smell of cold. It was still September. Winter was months away. It did not feel like months. It felt like days. The impossible situation was not complicated. It was simply mathematics. Cora had 11 cows and 2 spring calves. A proper wintering setup required windbreak, heavy feed, dry bedding, and either a solid shed or extraordinary luck. She had none of these things in sufficient quantity. She had $31, which would buy perhaps half the lumber she needed if she could find anyone willing to haul it before the roads turned bad. She had one boy who could work, but who was not yet grown, and no hired hand because she could not pay wages. She had a half-finished shack that would barely keep herself and Eli alive, let alone provide shelter for livestock. The conventional answer was to build a barn, a real barn with board walls and a proper roof and enough interior space for the herd to stand out of the wind. But a real barn cost money she did not have, required labor she could not hire, and demanded time that the calendar refused to give. She could not buy enough sawn lumber before prices climbed and roads became impassable. She could not hire a crew. She could not stable the herd in the shack or the shallow dugout she used for root storage. The open-range solution, letting cattle drift and break snow on their own, was exactly what had ruined her husband's confidence in the place, and every rancher in the territory knew that overgrazing and poor condition going into winter was what made hard seasons deadly. Cora walked the cattle lot in the evening light, counting fence posts, measuring distances with her eyes. The lot was 60 feet long and 22 feet wide. It held the 11 cows and 2 calves with room to move, but not room to spare. The fence was pole construction, sturdy enough to contain animals, but offering no protection from wind. She tried to imagine what a barn would look like in this space. A proper structure, board-sided, with a roof that would shed snow and walls that would block the cutting northwest wind. The image formed clearly in her mind. She could see it. She could not build it. What she could not see was any other option. The idea came to her 3 weeks later, and it came in pieces. The first piece arrived on a cold morning in early October, when Cora noticed where her cattle chose to sleep. They did not spread evenly across the lot. Instead, they crowded together in the southeast corner, pressed against the rough board section of fence, where Thomas had nailed up some old planking to patch a gap. It was the only part of the fence that blocked wind rather than letting it through. The second piece came the following week, when she checked on a straw pile she had positioned against the fence as a temporary insulation. The straw on the outside was crusted with frost. The straw on the inside, where it pressed against the boards, was merely cold damp, not frozen. The boards and straw together were doing something that neither could do alone. The third piece came from a neighbor's place, 4 miles distant, where Cora went to trade for eggs. The neighbor, a tired woman named Mrs. Garrett, kept her chickens in a lean-to shelter made of mud-daubed boards and woven brush. It was an ugly thing, low and crude, barely tall enough for a person to crouch inside. But when Cora stepped through the low doorway to collect the eggs, she felt the temperature change. The interior was not warm exactly, but it was warmer than it had any right to be. The smell was wet straw and feathers and the faint ammonia of bird droppings. The sound was the soft clucking of hens who had not yet learned that their shelter was supposed to be inadequate. Cora stood in that crude chicken house and pressed her palm against the inside wall. The mud-daubed boards felt merely cool. Outside, the wind was cutting. Inside, the air was still. Still air, she thought. Still air is half a blanket. The memory surfaced without warning. Her mother's voice, from years ago, explaining why the willow-woven walls of a lambing shed worked better than they looked. The mud doesn't make heat, her mother had said. The animals make heat. The mud just keeps the wind from stealing it. Cora walked back to her claim in the gathering dusk, turning the idea over in her mind. She could not afford a barn, but she might be able to afford a skin, a covering, something that would wrap around the cattle lot and keep the wind from eating the warmth her animals produced. She could not build up, but perhaps she could build over. Owen Bell arrived 2 days later to deliver a repaired harness buckle. Bell was a neighboring settler, part-time blacksmith, and the closest thing Cora had to a friend in the territory. He was 43 years old, a widower with a grown son who had gone east for work, and he had the practical manner of a man who had learned to survive by solving problems one at a time. He was not unkind. He was simply realistic, and realism on the frontier often looked like doubt. He found Cora in the lot, driving stakes into the ground in paired rows along the fence line. Eli was helping, his face red from effort and cold, his breath coming in visible puffs. "What are you building?" Bell asked. Cora straightened, pressing her hands against her lower back. "A shelter." "For the cattle?" "Yes." Bell looked at the stakes. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the sky, which had taken on the flat gray color of approaching weather. "You can't build a barn that size with stakes," he said. "Not one that'll hold." "I'm not building a barn." "Then what?" Cora hesitated. She had not explained the idea to anyone yet, partly because she was not certain it would work, and partly because she knew how it would sound. But Bell was here, and he was asking, and she needed to hear the objection out loud so she could answer it. "I'm going to bend saplings into hoops," she said. "Plant them in these stake lines, arch them over the pen, weave brush across them, cover the whole thing with straw and mud." Bell stared at her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "You're going to put a basket over your cows." "Not a basket. A shell. Something to block the wind and hold their warmth in." "Cora," Bell's voice was careful, the voice of a man trying not to say something cruel. "Even if brush keeps snow off, how does the mud make air warm?" "It doesn't." Cora picked up another stake and positioned it against the frozen ground. "The cows make the warmth. The mud just keeps the wind from taking it." "That's," Bell started again. "That's not how people winter cattle. People winter cattle in barns. I don't have a barn. You could sell some, pay down the debt, winter fewer animals in a smaller space. If I sell now at distress prices, I won't have enough breeding stock to recover. I need these cows. I need them alive in the spring." Bell was quiet. Cora could see him working through the objection, trying to find the flaw in her reasoning that would prove she was wrong. She almost wanted him to find it. If there was a flaw, better to know now than after she had spent weeks building something useless. "The mud will crack," he said finally. "First good freeze, first thaw, it'll crack and the wind will get through. I'll patch it. The structure will sag. Greenwood bends, but it doesn't hold shape under weight. First heavy snow, the whole thing comes down on your animals. I'll tie it while it's still flexible, let it dry in position. And the air inside, 11 cows breathing in an enclosed space, the damp will build up, it'll foul, your animals will get sick." Cora nodded. This was the objection she had been waiting for, the one she did not yet have an answer to. "I don't know," she said. "I think I need to leave openings, vents, enough to let the bad air out without letting all the warmth escape." "You think?" "I think." She drove the stake into the ground with 3 hard blows of the mallet. "I don't know if this will work, but I know what happens if I do nothing. If I do nothing, they freeze. At least this way, I'm trying." Bell watched her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and handed her the repaired buckle. "I hope you're right," he said. "I truly do." He did not offer to help, but he did not tell her she was a fool either. On the frontier, sometimes that was as much as anyone could give. Abel Crow arrived the following week, and he was not interested in understanding. Crow was the storekeeper in the nearest settlement, 3 hours by wagon. More importantly, he was the note holder on part of Cora's claim. When Thomas had taken the mortgage against next year's calf crop, he had done it through Crow's store, and the debt remained even though the husband had vanished. If Cora failed to pay, Crow could press his claim on the cattle, and eventually on the land itself. He found Cora and Eli in the middle of the lot, wrestling a freshly cut sapling into an arc. The willow was green and flexible, bending without breaking, but it took both of them to hold it in position while they lashed it to the stakes. Cora's hands were raw from the work. Eli's face was pale with exhaustion. "Mrs. Whitfield," Crow said. He did not dismount. "I came to discuss the matter of your account." Cora kept working. "I'm aware of the account." "Are you aware that payment is due in the spring? That if you cannot produce the calves your husband pledged, the balance comes due in cash?" "I'm aware." "And are you aware that what you're building here," Crow gestured at the half-formed arc of willow, the stakes, the scattered brush, "will not change that obligation?" Cora pulled the lashing tight and tied it off. Then she straightened and looked at Crow directly. He was a large man, well-fed in a country where most people were thin. His coat was new wool. His horse was better than any Cora had seen on a working ranch. "What I'm building here," she said, "is a chance to keep my cattle alive through the winter. If they're alive in the spring, I can pay what I owe." "With what? These animals?" Crow laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've been in this territory for 12 years. I've seen plenty of settlers try to winter stock in arrangements like this. Do you know what happens?" "Tell me." "They lose the animals anyway. The structure fails, or the cold gets through, or disease takes hold in the close quarters. And then they can't pay their debts, and they lose everything, not just the cattle, the land, the claim, everything they put 5 years into building." Cora felt Eli move closer to her, felt his shoulder press against her arm. He was scared. She was scared too. But fear was not a reason to stop. "Is that a prediction?" she asked, "or a preference?" Crow's expression flickered. For just a moment, something showed in his eyes, a calculation, a weighing of options. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth mask of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "I'm offering you an alternative," he said. "Sell me 4 cows now, today. I'll take them against the debt at a fair price. You'll winter fewer animals, need less feed, have a better chance of keeping the rest alive. And if you fail, at least you'll have reduced what you owe." "At what price?" $20 a head. Cora felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. $20 a head for breeding cows worth twice that in a normal market. Crow wasn't offering help. He was offering to profit from her desperation. "No," she said. "Think carefully, Mrs. Whitfield. Winter's coming. If the snow takes your herd, the note comes due just the same. You'll have nothing left." "Then I'll have nothing left. But I won't hand you my cattle at half their value so you can wait for me to fail." Crow stared at her for a long moment. Then he gathered his reins and turned his horse. "Pride is a luxury, Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "I wonder if you can afford it." He rode away. Cora stood in the lot with her brother beside her and watched him go. Her hands were shaking, though whether from cold or anger or fear, she could not tell. "Cora," Eli said quietly, "what if he's right?" "He's not right. He's just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Cora looked at the half-built frame, the saplings arching over the lot like the ribs of some great skeletal creature. It looked ridiculous. It looked impossible. It looked like exactly the kind of desperate gamble that Crow expected to fail. Waiting for me to give up, she said. So let's not give him the satisfaction. Marit Lund appeared on a gray morning in late October when the sky was the color of old iron and the first real cold was beginning to settle into the ground. Cora had gone hunting for longer saplings and a better source of clay. The willows near her claim were adequate for smaller work, but the hoops needed to span 22 feet, and that required trees she did not have. She had heard rumors of a timbered draw several miles to the north, where a Norwegian widow kept a small holding and knew the land better than anyone. She found the draw easily enough. She found Marit Lunde harder. The woman was 61 years old, small and weathered, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood she worked with. She was patching a root cellar entrance when Cora arrived, weaving willow switches into a frame, packing mud and straw between them with the easy confidence of long practice. Cora explained what she needed. Saplings, clay, any advice the older woman might offer. Marit listened without interrupting. When Cora finished, she set down her tools and walked to where the work was visible. "Show me your hands," she said. Cora showed her. The blisters, the raw patches, the calluses already forming from weeks of cutting and bending and lashing. Marit nodded. "You've been doing the work yourself. Who else would do it? Most women would have given up by now, or found a man to do it for them." "I don't have a man. I don't have time to give up." Something shifted in Marit's expression. Not warmth exactly. She did not seem like a warm woman, but something that might have been recognition, the look of someone seeing a quality they understood. "Come," she said. "I'll show you the draw." The draw was everything Cora had hoped for. Young cottonwoods and willows grew thick along a seasonal creek, their trunks straight and their wood still green enough to bend. The clay bank on the north side was rich with the heavy gray soil that held together when wet and hardened when dry. But Marit did not simply show her the materials. She showed her how to use them. "You're cutting wrong," Marit said, watching Cora select a sapling. "You want the ones that bend without cracking, feel the grain, thicker at the base, yes, but matched in pairs. If one is heavier than the other, the arch will pull to one side." Cora felt the sapling she had chosen. It was good wood, green, and flexible, but when she compared it to its neighbor, she could see what Marit meant. The two were not matched. One was slightly thicker, slightly stiffer. An arch made from them would be uneven. She selected different saplings. Marit nodded. "The lashing," Marit continued. "You tie them after you bend them, yes? But you should cross-bind the ribs before the wood dries, while it still flexes. Once it sets, it holds the shape. If you wait until it's stiff, you're fighting the wood instead of working with it." Cora remembered the hoops she had already installed, lashed quickly in the cold, already beginning to dry. Some of them were pulling against the bindings. Some of them would probably fail. "I'll have to redo them," she said. "Some of them, not all." Marit pulled a willow switch from her bundle and began weaving it through her fingers, demonstrating. "Weave the lighter rods while the frame still moves. That gives the whole structure flexibility. When the snow loads it, it bends instead of breaking. Like a basket. Like a good basket. The kind that holds weight without cracking." They worked through the morning. Marit teaching through action, Cora learning by doing. By noon, Cora had cut and matched 20 pairs of saplings, loaded them onto her wagon, and learned more about wattle construction than she had gathered in weeks of trial and error. "The mud," she said as they rested. "I've been mixing it wrong, haven't I?" Marit smiled for the first time. It was a thin smile, more acknowledgement than warmth, but it was real. Clay-heavy soil cracks, she said. Straight mud slumps. You need both, but neither alone. Chop in straw, old dried grass. Manure if you have it, the binding helps. Apply it in thin lifts, not thick coats. Patch it as it dries, and don't seal it completely. The venting. Yes, your cows will breathe, and their breath will be warm and wet. If you trap it, the air goes bad. Sour. Sick animals. Marit pointed at the ridge of a distant shed, barely visible through the trees. Leave gaps at the top. The hot air rises, the bad air escapes, the cold air sinks. That's the exchange that keeps them breathing clean. Cora looked at the older woman. Marit had not offered charity. She had not offered pity or false encouragement. She had simply recognized something, competence, determination, the specific quality of someone who watched animals instead of trying to impress town and responded to it with respect. "Why are you helping me?" Cora asked. Marit was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I know what it is to be alone in the cold with something to protect. And I know what it feels like when someone treats that as a reason for respect instead of a reason for dismissal." She handed Cora a bundle of willow switches, already stripped and sorted by thickness. "Come back when you need more. I'll be here." The construction entered its hardest phase in the first weeks of November. Cora and Eli worked from dawn until dark, stopping only when the light failed or their hands became too numb to grip tools. The frame went up rib by rib, each pair of saplings bent into an arch and planted in the stake lines, cross pieces lashed in place while the wood was still flexible. The work was brutal. The cold deepened every day. Cora's hands cracked and bled despite the grease she rubbed into them every night. Eli developed a cough that would not go away. The cattle watched from the corners of the lot, their breath rising in plumes, their eyes dark and uncomprehending. By the end of the first week, the frame was complete. 20 hoop pairs arched over the lot, spaced 3 feet apart, their tops meeting in a rough ridge that ran the full 60 feet of the structure. It looked like the skeleton of some great beached creature, all ribs and empty spaces. Then came the weaving, lighter willow switches and brush, laced through the ribs in overlapping layers. This was slower work, more tedious, but it required less strength. Eli could do much of it while Cora handled the heavier tasks. Then came the straw. Bundles of it, stacked thickest on the north and west flanks where the wind would hit hardest. They used everything they had, the hay that should have been feed, marsh grass cut from the edge of a slough 2 miles away, even old bedding from the shack. The structure turned from skeleton to shaggy beast, bristling with dried vegetation. Finally, the mud. Marit came twice to help, showing Cora how to mix the daub clay soil tempered with chopped straw and the manure the cattle obligingly provided. They pressed it into the straw by hand and paddle, building up the weather side in thin lifts that dried between applications. The work consumed everything. Cora ate when she remembered to eat. She slept when her body gave her no choice. She dreamed of willow arches and the smell of wet clay and the distant bawling of cattle whose voices she heard even in her sleep. Progress markers. Week 1. Frame complete but skin thin. Week 2. North wall sealed. East opening reduced to a gap barely wide enough for a cow to enter. Week 3. Bedding laid inside so the cattle stood above frozen muck. Feed trough moved to the leeward edge. Then came the setback. The first hard dry wind hit on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning the mud coat on the north wall had cracked. Not everywhere, just in patches where the daub had been too thick, where it had dried too fast, where Cora had not followed Marit's instructions closely enough. But the cracks were visible, and through them the wind cut like a knife. Cora spent 2 days patching. Then one of the hoops split, a sapling that had been slightly too dry when bent, that had given way under the accumulated stress of cold and contraction. The whole section sagged. Eli helped her prop it with a forked branch while she lashed in a replacement. Then Eli cut his palm on a stripped willow end. The wound was deep enough to need binding, and for 3 days he could barely grip tools. The work slowed to a crawl. Then the wagon of extra straw that Cora had been counting on, a delivery from the Garrett place, promised in exchange for labor come spring, never arrived. Mrs. Garrett's husband had fallen ill. The straw stayed where it was. Then early sleet turned the lot into muck. The cattle stamped and shifted, their hooves churning the ground into a freezing slurry that threatened hoof rot and fouled the bedding Cora had so carefully laid. She spent a full day hauling in fresh straw to lay over the worst of it. Through all of it, the structure rose. Not beautiful, not impressive, but present. Owen Bell rode by one afternoon and stood looking at it for a long time. The mud-colored hump stretched across the lot, steaming faintly in the cold air where the cattle's breath found cracks in the covering. "I still think the air inside will go bad," he said finally. Cora pointed at the ridge where she had deliberately left narrow vent gaps. "The hot air rises, the bad air escapes. The cold air sinks and pushes in at the bottom. It circulates." "You hope." "I know. Marit showed me." Bell nodded slowly. He did not say he believed her, but when he left, he told her to bring her mare by his place for shoeing. "Half price," he said, because winter was coming. Small kindnesses. They were not conversion, but they were something. By late November, the structure stood complete. It was squat and ugly and convincing only at close range. From a distance, it looked ridiculous, a long mud-colored hump dropped over a cattle pen, too low for a barn, too crude for anything that ought to work. The roof was barely 8 feet high at the ridge, sloping down to 5 feet at the edges. The straw covering bristled with uneven patches. The mud skin was mottled with repairs, but it was finished. Cora began watching for signs that the structure was doing something. She had no thermometer, no instruments, nothing but her own senses and the behavior of her animals. What she saw: frost formed heavily on the outside of the north wall, but less heavily on the inside. The mud and straw were catching the cold before it could reach the interior. The bedding stayed drier where drafts no longer raked through. In the corners where the covering was thickest, the straw was merely cold instead of frozen solid. The cattle stopped bunching violently in one corner and spread more evenly through the space. They were no longer fighting for the single sheltered spot. The whole space was sheltered now. Breath lingered in the interior air at dawn. When Cora ducked through the low eastern opening, she could see vapor hanging in the still space above the cattle's backs. Warmth was collecting. Heat the animals produced was staying instead of being stripped away. She did not know if it would be enough, but something was happening. Angus Vale returned the week before the first real cold hit. He walked the outside of the structure slowly, slapping the mud-hardened skin with his palm, bending to examine the base where the walls met the frozen ground. Then he ducked inside and stood among the cattle, breathing the air, touching the walls, studying the vent gaps in the ridge. "It blocks wind," he said finally. "I'll give you that." But the first wet blizzard will drive chill through everything. Wet cold is different from dry cold. The damp gets into the straw, freezes solid, and then you've got an ice shell instead of an insulated one. Cora nodded. She had thought about this. "If the straw freezes, I'll pile more on top. Fresh dry straw over frozen straw." "You have enough for that?" "I'll find enough." Vale looked at her. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted. He was no longer dismissing her. He was merely doubting. It might work, he said. Might. In a mild winter. But this winter isn't going to be mild. Everyone knows it. The signs are all wrong. What signs? The corn husks are thicker than I've ever seen. The geese went south early. The horses' coats came in heavy before September was out. Vale pulled his collar tighter against the wind. This winter's going to kill cattle all over the territory. Professional operations with proper barns and proper feed are going to lose stock. And you think you're going to save 11 head with a mud tunnel? I think I'm going to try. Vale was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked toward his horse. I hope you're right, he said. I truly do. But he did not say he believed her. And when he rode away, Cora stood in the lot and watched him go, and she wondered if she believed herself. The first real cold arrived on December 1st. Cora woke to silence, the profound silence that comes when the world has frozen solid overnight. No wind, no bird song, no distant cattle sounds from neighboring claims, just the absolute quiet of air too cold to move. She dressed quickly, layering everything she owned, and stepped outside. The thermometer on the shack wall, an old alcohol instrument that Thomas had hung years ago, read 16 degrees below zero. The cold hit her lungs like a fist. Her breath crystallized instantly in the air, falling like tiny crystals of ice. She walked to the cattle shelter. Frost had formed on the outside of the mud skin, thick and white, giving the structure the appearance of something dead and frozen. But when she ducked through the eastern opening, she felt the difference immediately. The interior was cold, but it was not 16 below. It was cold in the way that a root cellar is cold, chilled, damp, but survivable. The cattle stood in their places, breath rising in slow plumes, eyes reflecting the gray light that filtered through the gaps. 11 cows, 2 spring calves, all standing, all breathing. Cora pressed her palm against the inside of the north wall. Cold damp, not frozen. The mud skin, the straw, the accumulated warmth of 11 animal bodies together, they were holding back the cold. She fed the animals. She broke ice on the water trough. She checked the vent gaps for blockage, found one partially iced over, and cleared it with her fingers until the opening whistled with escaping air. The cattle ate. The cattle drank. The cattle lived. But December 1st was not the test. December 1st was just the warning. The true test came in January. The cold that had arrived in December deepened through the holidays. Temperatures that had seemed unbearable became normal. The ground froze so hard that fence posts cracked. Water troughs grew ice so thick that Cora spent an hour each morning breaking through to liquid. Then, on the 12th of January, the blizzard arrived. It came from the northwest with the speed of cavalry. One moment the sky was gray, but still. The next moment it was white, a solid wall of driven snow that reduced visibility to nothing. The wind hit 60 miles an hour, screaming across the flats with nothing to stop it. Cora had 3 minutes warning. She had been walking from the shack to the shelter when she saw the wall approaching. She ran. She made it to the shelter just as the storm hit. The wind caught the eastern opening and tried to drive snow straight into the interior. Cora threw herself against the gap, holding a canvas sheet she had prepared for exactly this moment, trying to reduce the opening without sealing it completely. "Eli," she screamed, "the stakes, now!" Eli appeared through the whiteout, clutching the wooden stakes and rope they had positioned near the entrance. Together, in the howling wind, they stretched the canvas across the opening, leaving gaps at the top and bottom for air exchange, and staked it into the frozen ground. The shelter groaned. The wind hit the north wall like a battering ram, and the whole structure shuddered. Cora heard the saplings creaking, heard the straw rustling, heard the mud skin cracking and popping as the temperature dropped. But it held. For the first hour, Cora stood inside the shelter with her cattle and listened to the world try to tear everything apart. The wind screamed, the snow piled against the walls, the temperature dropped and dropped and dropped. Eli's cough worsened. By evening, he was feverish, shaking with chills even inside the relative warmth of the shelter. Cora dragged extra bedding from the shack, blankets, old coats, everything she could find, and wrapped him in it, propping him in the corner where the cattle's bodies created the most warmth. Then she went back to work. The vent line on the lee side had caked with blown sleet. If she did not clear it, the air inside would foul. She climbed onto a crate, reached through the gap, and punched at the ice until her fist bled, and the opening whistled with released pressure. A weak cow, one of the older animals, thin despite the extra feed Cora had been giving her, went down in the early hours of the morning. In an open lot, she would have frozen within the hour, her body heat bleeding into the wind until her organs failed. Here, Cora hauled her onto thicker bedding, piled straw over her body, and kept her warm enough to survive until dawn. The cow rose on shaky legs as gray light filtered through the gaps. She had made it. Outside, the world was white and silent. The storm had passed. Cora opened the canvas curtain and stepped into a changed landscape. The snow had drifted 8 feet against the north wall of the shelter. The eastern opening was nearly buried. Only the top third remained clear, and even that was packed with wind-blown crust. The shack, 50 yards away, had snow piled to the eaves on the windward side, but the shelter stood. The outside of the mudskin had frozen hard as pottery, the accumulated moisture in the surface layer crystallizing into something that looked almost like glazed ceramic. But beneath that frozen crust, the straw was still serving as insulation. The temperature differential between outside and inside was measurable in the frost patterns, thick on the exterior, thin on the interior, non-existent on the inner surface where the cattle's breath kept everything damp and above freezing. Cora looked toward the neighboring claims. She could see smoke from the Bell place, 2 miles distant. She could see the dark shape of the Garrett property beyond that. And scattered across the white expanse between, she could see dark shapes that did not move. Cattle, frozen where they had bunched against fences and buildings that offered no protection, dead in the snow. She did not count them. She did not need to. Owen Bell arrived that afternoon, riding a horse that steamed with exhaustion. "The Garrett boy," he said, "nearly froze last night trying to save a heifer. His father's too sick to move him. Can you help?" Cora did not hesitate. "Bring them here, both of them." Bell looked at the shelter, the crude mud hump, the sagging canvas curtain, the cattle visible through the gaps. "Here? The lee side is warmest. We can make a space." They brought the boy first. He was 14, blue-lipped and barely conscious, his fingers and toes threatening frostbite. Cora wrapped him in blankets and positioned him where the cattle's bodies radiated the most heat. The heifer, a young animal, terrified and shaking, they dragged to the lee wall and covered with straw. By evening, the boy's color had improved. The heifer was standing. Abel Crow arrived the next morning. He did not enter the shelter. He sat on his horse in the trampled snow outside the eastern opening and looked at the structure that he had said would fail. "Lucky," he said. "You got lucky with pen placement." Cora was too tired to argue. "Probably. Better Hay would have done the same." "Maybe." Crow sat there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his horse and rode away. He did not say he was wrong. He would never say he was wrong, but he did not say she had failed either. And in the silence of his departure, Cora heard something that sounded almost like acknowledgement. Angus Vale arrived a week later, after the worst had passed. He walked into the shelter without asking permission. He moved among the cattle, checking their condition, feeling their coats, examining their eyes and hooves. He counted them. 11 cows, 2 calves, all standing, all breathing. Then he walked to the inside of the north wall and pressed his palm against the surface, exactly as Cora had done on the first cold morning. Cold damp, he said, not frozen. No. The wind didn't get through. No. Vale turned to face her. His expression was strange, not warmth exactly, but something that might have been respect, or shame, or both. I told you they'd bawl under the snow by dawn, he said. I was wrong. Cora did not know what to say. She had spent so long preparing for this conversation that she had never imagined what she would do when it arrived. Your method worked, Vale continued. I don't understand why, not fully, but it worked. My nephew lost 8 head in a draw 2 miles from here. They bunched against a fence, and the snow crust kept them from foraging, and they froze where they stood. Your cattle are standing in a mud tunnel eating hay. It's not just the mud, Cora said. It's the wind. The mud blocks the wind, and the cattle make heat, and the heat stays instead of being stripped away. Vale nodded slowly. Still air, he said. Half a blanket. Cora stared at him. Where did you hear that? Your neighbor, the Norwegian woman. She came by after the storm, said I should ride out and see what you'd built before I opened my mouth again about what was possible. Marit. Of course it was Marit. She was right, Vale said. I should have looked before I spoke. I've wintered cattle for 18 seasons, and I never thought to try something like this. I thought I knew everything there was to know. I was wrong about that, too. He extended his hand. Cora took it. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who had worked with animals his whole life. You taught me something, he said. I don't expect you to forgive the things I said before, but I hope you'll accept that I know better now. Cora held his hand for a moment longer. Then she released it. I accept it, she said. And I'd be grateful if you tell others what you saw here, not for my sake, for theirs. Vale nodded. I will, he said. I promise you that. He walked out of the shelter and mounted his horse, but before he rode away, he turned back one more time. The Norwegian woman was right about something else, he said. You're not just surviving out here, you're building something, and that's worth more than anything I could have told you. He rode away into the white landscape, his horse picking its way through the drifts. Cora stood in the opening of the shelter and watched him go. Inside, the cattle shifted and breathed. Outside, the snow stretched to the horizon, marked with the dark shapes of animals that had not been so lucky. She had survived the worst night of the worst winter anyone could remember. Now she had to survive whatever came next. The days after the blizzard brought a different kind of work. Cora spent the first week digging out. Snow had drifted so deep against the shelter's north wall that the structure seemed to emerge from a white hillside, its mudskin invisible beneath 8 feet of packed drift. She cleared the vents first, then the eastern opening, then a path to the shack. Eli's fever broke on the 3rd day, but he remained weak, and she would not let him work in the cold until his cough subsided. The cattle were restless after days of confinement. She let them out in small groups to move and stretch, then drove them back inside before dark. The temperature had moderated, only 10 below instead of 30, but she trusted the shelter now in a way she had not before the storm. Neighbors began arriving the 2nd week. Owen Bell came first, as she had expected. He walked the exterior of the shelter slowly, touching the frozen mud skin, examining the places where the structure met the ground. Then he ducked inside and stood among the cattle, breathing the air, studying the construction with the careful attention of a man who built things for a living. The frame held, he said finally. Yes. Under 8 feet of drift. Yes. Bell was quiet for a moment. His expression was strange, not quite shame, not quite admiration, but something between the two. I told you the air would go bad, he said. I told you the structure would sag. I was wrong about both. Cora shrugged. You were asking the right questions. If I hadn't thought about the venting, the air would have gone bad. If I hadn't cross-bound the ribs, the structure would have sagged. But you did think about it. You figured it out. Bell looked at her directly. How? Marit Lund. She showed me what I was doing wrong before I made mistakes I couldn't fix. The Norwegian woman. Yes. Bell nodded slowly. He seemed to be working something out in his mind, some calculation that had nothing to do with construction. I have a calf shed on my place, he said. Board walls, but no proper roof. Just canvas stretched over poles. It held through the storm, but barely. The canvas tore in 3 places, and 2 of my calves froze before I could get them moved. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. I'm asking if you can show me how to do what you did. The weaving, the mud, the way the ribs bend without breaking. He paused. I'll pay for the lesson, whatever you think is fair. Cora felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly. She was too tired for pride. But something close to it. The feeling of being asked for knowledge instead of offering excuses. You don't have to pay, she said. But you do have to help me cut more saplings. I used everything I had, and I'll need more for repairs. Bell extended his hand. Cora took it. Deal, he said. The community came slowly at first, then all at once. Mrs. Garrett arrived 3 days after Bell. Her husband recovered enough to manage the homestead while she was away. She brought eggs and questions in equal measure. How wide should the hoops span? How thick should the straw layer be? What mud mix stuck best in freezing weather? Cora answered what she could. The hoops should span no more than the saplings could bend without cracking. For most willow, that meant 20 to 25 feet. The straw layer should be thick enough that you could not see daylight through it, but not so thick that it trapped moisture against the frame. The mud mix needed clay for binding, straw for flexibility, and manure for both applied in thin lifts, patched as it dried, never sealed completely. She found herself demonstrating as she explained, showing Mrs. Garrett how to feel the grain of a sapling before cutting it, how to test mud consistency by squeezing it in her fist, how to weave brush through ribs so the pattern locked itself in place. Mrs. Garrett watched with the focused attention of someone who had lost animals and did not intend to lose them again. My husband said you were foolish, she said when the demonstration was finished. He said no one winters cattle in a basket. What does he say now? He says nothing. He just looks at the dead stock on every claim between here and town and doesn't say a word. A young man from the settlement arrived the following week, then a family from a claim near the river, then 2 brothers who had lost half their herd and wanted to know how to save the other half. Each time, Cora showed them what she had learned. Each time she answered questions she had not known she could answer. She did not charge for the knowledge. She did not keep records of who owed her what. She simply taught, the way Marit had taught her, through action, through demonstration, through the patient repetition of skills that could not be learned from description alone. The word spread. By the end of January, people were calling it different things. The sapling vault, the mud tunnel, the basket shelter. Cora did not care what they called it. She cared only that they were building and that their animals might survive what hers had survived. Abel Crow heard the talk. Of course he heard, and when he heard, he came. Crow arrived on a gray morning in early February, when the worst of the cold had passed but spring was still months away. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse in the trampled snow outside the shelter and watched Cora working on a repair, a section of mudskin that had cracked during the thaw-freeze cycle, letting wind whistle through. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I see you've become popular." Cora did not stop working. People are interested in keeping their animals alive. People are interested in anything that sounds like magic, but magic doesn't last. The first hard spring storm, these structures will all collapse. The first summer heat, they'll rot where they stand. And then everyone who listened to you will be worse off than if they'd never tried. Maybe. Not maybe. Certainly. Crow shifted in his saddle. I've been in this territory for 12 years. I've seen plenty of fads come and go. Sod houses that melted in the rain, dugouts that flooded in the spring, hay barns that caught fire from spontaneous combustion. People try things, and the things fail, and then they're left with nothing. Is there a point to this? Crow's expression flickered. The point is that your debt remains. The spring will come, and the calves your husband pledged will be expected. And if you cannot produce them, or their equivalent in cash, the note will come due. Your little mud tunnel doesn't change the mathematics of what you owe. Cora set down her trowel and turned to face him. She was tired of this man, tired of his calculations, his predictions, his endless waiting for her to fail. "Mr. Crow," she said, "my cattle are alive. My spring calves are alive. My neighbor's cattle are alive because I showed them how to build what I built. When the calves are weaned, I will sell what I need to sell to pay what I owe. And if I cannot pay everything, I will pay what I can and negotiate the rest." Negotiate. Crow made the word sound like a disease. Yes, negotiate, the way people do when they face difficulty but refuse to surrender. And if I'm not interested in negotiation, then you'll find yourself with a debt that cannot be collected from someone who has nothing. I expect you'd prefer partial payment to none at all. They stared at each other across the trampled snow. Crow's face was unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted. He had come expecting to find her weakened by the winter, ready to make concessions. Instead, he had found her working. "We'll see," he said finally. "We'll see what spring brings." He rode away without another word. Cora watched him go, then turned back to her repair. The mud was cold under her hands, but it was setting properly, and the crack was closing, and the shelter was holding. That would have to be enough. Marit Lune came for the last time in the third week of February. She arrived on foot, as she usually did, carrying a bundle of willow switches she had cut from her draw. But she moved more slowly than before, and when she reached the shelter, she sat down on a stump and did not rise for several minutes. "The winter took something from me," she said when Cora asked if she was well. "I can feel it. The cold got into my bones and stayed there." "You should rest." "I have rested. Resting doesn't bring back what the cold takes." Marit looked at the shelter, at the repairs Cora had made, the modifications, the improvements. "You've been teaching." "Trying to." "Not trying, teaching. I've heard the reports. People building like you showed them. Animals surviving that should have died." Marit smiled, the thin smile that Cora had come to know well. "That was the whole point, you know. Not just surviving yourself, showing others what you learned." "I couldn't have learned it without you." "You would have figured it out eventually. I just saved you time." Marit rose slowly from the stump, steadying herself against the shelter wall. "Come, there's one more thing I want to show you." They walked to the ridge where the vent gaps ran. Marit pointed at a section where the straw had compressed under snow weight, narrowing the opening. "Too tight," she said. "When it warms up, when the cattle breathe harder, this gap will not be enough. The air will sour before it can escape." "I was going to widen it." "Good, but don't just widen it. Build a hood over it. Marit traced the shape in the air with her hands. A little roof made of board scraps, angled so rain and snow slide off, but open underneath so the air can escape upward. It will keep working even when the weather tries to seal it. Cora studied the gap, imagining the modification. Like a chimney cap. Like a chimney cap. Yes. Marit lowered her hands. You understand faster than most. That's why I helped you. That, and because you watched what the wind was doing instead of fighting what you couldn't change. They stood together in the gray February light, looking at the shelter that should not have worked and had worked anyway. Marit's breath came shallow, and her color was not good, but she seemed content. I won't see another winter, she said quietly. I know the feeling. I've seen it in others. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. Marit turned to face her. I'm not afraid. I've lived long enough to see what I know passed on. That's more than most people get. Cora did not know what to say. She had prepared for many things, weather, skepticism, financial ruin, but not for this. Not for the loss of the person who had seen something in her when no one else had. You taught me everything, she said. I taught you what I knew. You figured out the rest yourself. Marit placed a hand on Cora's arm, and her grip was surprisingly strong. The wind will always try to take what you have. The cold will always try to steal your warmth. But if you watch, and if you think, and if you're not too proud to learn from what you see, you can beat them both. She let go of Cora's arm and began walking back toward her draw. Cora wanted to call after her, to say something that would change what she had just heard, but there was nothing to say. Marit Lunde walked into the gray distance and did not look back. Marit died in the first week of March. A neighbor found her in her cabin, peaceful in her bed, as if she had simply decided to stop breathing. They buried her on a hillside overlooking the draw where she had cut willow for 40 years. Cora stood at the graveside with a handful of other mourners, people Marit had helped, taught, guided, and felt something crack inside her chest that had nothing to do with cold. That night, alone in her shack while Eli slept, Cora sat by the stove and thought about everything Marit had shown her, the green wood selection, the cross-binding, the mud mix, the vent gaps, a lifetime of knowledge, passed from one woman to another in a few weeks of desperate work. She thought about what Marit had said at the end. You watched what the wind was doing. That was the whole trick. It had not felt like a trick. It had felt like survival. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the trick and the survival were the same thing. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the stove until dawn, and then she walked to the shelter and began the modifications Marit had described. The vent hood took 2 days to build. She used board scraps from the shack, pieces of siding that had been destined for the north wall before winter interrupted everything, and fashioned them into a peaked cover that sheltered the vent gaps from above while leaving them open to the upward flow of escaping air. When she finished, she pressed her hand against the inside of the shelter wall and felt the difference. The air circulated more freely. The smell was cleaner. The cattle breathed easier. Marit had been right. She was always right. The secondary crisis came in the last week of March, when everyone thought the worst was over. A warm spell had settled over the territory. 3 days of above-freezing temperatures that melted the surface snow and turned the frozen ground to mud. People began talking about spring, about planting, about the worst winter in memory finally ending. Then the temperature dropped 35 degrees in 6 hours, and everything that had melted froze solid. The ice storm hit 3 claims along the river bottom hardest. Cattle that had ventured out to graze found themselves trapped in fields that had become skating rinks overnight. Animals slipped, broke legs, froze where they fell. Calves that had been born in the warm spell died within hours of the cold's return. Owen Bell appeared at Cora's shelter at dawn, his horse steaming, his face grim. "The Harrison place," he said. "They've lost 4 calves already and have 3 more in trouble. Their board shed isn't holding. Is there anything—" Cora was already moving. "How far?" 2 miles, maybe less." "Eli, stay with the cattle. Bell, show me the way." They rode through a landscape that looked like glass. Every surface gleamed with ice, fences, roofs, the dead grass that poked through the snow. The Harrison claim was a chaos of panic and loss. John Harrison stood in his cattle lot trying to drive panicked animals into a board shed that was clearly inadequate, while his wife dragged frozen calves toward a fire that was too small to matter. Cora assessed the situation in seconds. The board shed had gaps between every plank. Wind whistled through freely. The cattle inside were no warmer than the cattle outside. "We need to seal the walls," she said. "Straw, canvas, anything you have. Pack it into the gaps and hold it in place with mud." "Mud?" Harrison stared at her. "The ground is frozen solid." "Scrape snow and ice into a pile. Build a fire under it. When it melts, mix it with soil and straw. It won't set properly in this cold, but it'll stick long enough to block the wind." Harrison looked at his wife, then at Belle, then at Cora. He was a proud man. Cora could see it in his posture, in the set of his jaw, and taking instructions from a woman in front of his neighbors was not easy for him. But his calves were dying. "All right," he said. "Show us." They worked through the morning. Cora directed, demonstrated, corrected. She showed them how to pack straw into the gaps, how to press the improvised mud mixture over the straw to hold it in place, how to reduce the opening without sealing it completely. The work was brutal. Their hands cracked and bled from the cold, but by noon, the worst gaps were sealed. Then Cora turned to the sick calves. "They need warmth. They can't make themselves," she said. "Hot stones wrapped in cloth placed against their bodies. The fire needs to be inside with them, not outside. Build it small in a clay-lined pit with a screen to keep sparks from the straw." Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened. "Fire inside, with all this straw?" "A small fire, carefully tended. The heat will rise and warm the space. The screen will contain the sparks. It's dangerous, but not as dangerous as letting them freeze." They did as she instructed. By evening, 2 of the 3 sick calves were standing. The third died despite their efforts, too far gone before they had started, but 2 saved from 3 was more than anyone had expected. Harrison walked Cora to her horse as she prepared to leave. His expression was complicated, gratitude mixed with something that might have been shame. "I didn't think you knew what you were doing," he said. "When I heard about your shelter, I thought it was luck, a fluke, something that worked once and wouldn't work again. What do you think now?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I should have listened sooner." Cora mounted her horse. Her hands ached. Her back ached. She had not eaten since dawn. "Next time you will," she said. "That's what matters." She rode home through the ice-glazed landscape, passing claims where people were still struggling with the aftermath of the freeze. At some of them, she stopped. At others, she simply pointed toward the Harrison place and told them to go see what had worked. Mart's voice echoed in her mind. Not just surviving yourself, showing others what you learned. She was tired. She was grieving. She was no longer certain what came next, but she was still teaching. Spring arrived in April, slow and grudging, as if the winter did not want to release its grip. The snow melted. The ice broke on the rivers. The grass began to show green beneath the brown, and cattle that had survived the winter began to put on condition. Cora's 11 cows had made it through. So had the 2 spring calves from the previous year, now nearly yearlings. and on a warm morning in late April, 3 of her cows delivered new calves, healthy, strong, born into a world that was finally warming. She sold 2 of them to pay the debt. Abel Crow came to collect. He looked at the calves, examined their condition, and wrote out a receipt for the payment. He did not apologize for anything he had said. He did not acknowledge that Cora's method had worked. He simply took what he was owed and prepared to leave. Then he stopped. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I may have need of a shelter like yours." Cora stared at him. Of all the things she had expected from Abel Crow, this was not on the list. "I've acquired some cattle," he continued, "from estates that failed during the winter. They need a place to survive next year, and the barn I had planned will not be completed in time." "You want me to show you how to build a mud tunnel?" "I want you to consider a business arrangement. I provide materials, sapling, straw, labor. You provide expertise. We split the profit from the cattle we save." Cora felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not conversion. This was calculation. Crow had seen that her method worked, and now he wanted to profit from it, just as he profited from everything else. "No," she said. Crow's expression flickered. "No? No business arrangement, no profit sharing, no partnership." Cora folded her arms across her chest. "But if you want to learn how to build, I'll teach you, the same way I've taught everyone else, for free." "That's—" Crow stopped, started again. "That's not how business works. It's how I work." Cora met his gaze directly. "You spent the whole winter waiting for me to fail. You told me I was foolish. You told me my cattle would freeze. You offered to buy them at half their value because you knew I was desperate. And now you want to be my partner?" Crow said nothing. "I don't need a partner," Cora continued. "I don't need your materials or your labor or your money. What I need is for people to stop losing animals they can't afford to lose. If you want to learn how to prevent that, I'll teach you. But I won't profit from you, and you won't profit from me. That's the only arrangement I'm interested in." They stared at each other across the spring mud. Crow's face was unreadable, but something in his posture had changed. He had come expecting negotiation, leverage, the kind of transaction he understood. Instead, he had found something he could not quantify. "I suppose mud has its uses," he said finally. Cora almost smiled. "I suppose it does." Crow mounted his horse and rode away. He did not say he would learn. He did not say he would come back. But he had asked, and that was something she had not expected. She stood in the spring mud and watched him go. Owen Bell came more often as the season warmed. At first his visits were about work. He brought tools to repair. He offered help with projects that needed a second pair of hands. He asked questions about the shelter, about modifications, about the principles underlying the design. But the visits grew longer. The conversations grew wider. They talked about the territory, about the future, about what it meant to build something in a place where everything tried to tear you down. One evening in late May, Bell arrived without a reason. No broken harness, no request for help, no question about construction. He simply appeared at the shack door and asked if Cora wanted to walk. They walked to the shelter and stood looking at it in the fading light. The mud skin had weathered through the winter, cracked in places, patched in others. The straw bristled unevenly. The vent hoods that Cora had added after Marit's death stood out like awkward afterthoughts. But the structure was sound. It had held. "I've been thinking," Bell said, "about next winter." "So have I." "I've been thinking about improvements. Modular spacing for different sizes of stock, thicker bedding in the center where animals cluster, detachable screens for storm-facing openings." Cora looked at him. These were not his ideas. These were ideas she had mentioned in passing weeks ago, while showing him how to repair a damaged rib. You've been paying attention, she said. I've been trying to. Belle was quiet for a moment. Then, I've also been thinking about what it would mean to face next winter together instead of separately. Cora felt her breath catch. She had not expected this, or perhaps she had expected it and refused to acknowledge the possibility. What do you mean? I mean that I'm tired of doing everything alone. I mean that you've built something here that works, and I want to help it work better. I mean, he stopped, started again. I mean that I'd like to ask if you'd consider letting me court you, properly, the way things ought to be done. Cora looked at the shelter, then at the sky, then at Owen Bell. He was not young, neither was she. They had both been married before, both lost spouses to death or abandonment. Both learned what it meant to survive without someone to lean on. She did not love him. Not yet. But she could imagine loving him. She could imagine what it would feel like to have someone beside her when the wind rose and the temperature dropped and the cattle needed saving. I'll consider it, she said. Belle smiled. It was not a triumphant smile, not the smile of a man who had won something. It was the smile of a man who had been given permission to hope. That's all I ask, he said. They married in the autumn of 1887, 1 year after the winter that should have killed everything. The ceremony was small. A few neighbors, a circuit preacher, vows exchanged in the yard outside the shack. Eli stood as witness, grown taller now and no longer coughing. Angus Vale attended uninvited, standing at the back of the small gathering with his hat in his hands. Afterward, when the guests had gone and the preacher had ridden away, Owen and Cora stood together in front of the shelter that had saved her cattle and changed her life. I never thought I'd do this again, Owen said. Do what? Believe that things could be different, that I could be happy instead of just surviving. Cora took his hand. His palm was calloused, rough from decades of work. It felt solid in her grip. Different is possible, she said. I learned that from someone. The Norwegian woman. Marit. Yes. Cora looked at the shelter, at the mud skin that had weathered another season, at the modifications she had made, and the modifications yet to come. She taught me that watching was more important than fighting, that working with what you had was better than wishing for what you didn't, that the point wasn't just surviving yourself, but showing others what you learned. Owen squeezed her hand. She sounds wise. She was. Cora felt the old grief rise and subside, the way it always did when she thought of Marit. She was the wisest person I ever knew. They stood together in the autumn light, watching the cattle move through the lot. 11 cows had become 14. The calves that had been born in the spring were growing. The breeding stock that Cora had risked everything to save was thriving. She had survived the worst winter anyone could remember. Now she was building something that might last. The years that followed were not easy, but they were not impossible either. Owen moved his remaining stock to Cora's claim, and they expanded the shelter system to accommodate a larger herd. The sapling vaults became a standard feature of the operation, 3 separate structures now, positioned to catch different winds, sized for different classes of stock. Cora taught anyone who asked. By the 3rd year after the Great Winter, there were shelter structures on a dozen claims along the lower James River. Not all of them were perfect. Some failed. Some needed repairs that their builders could not manage alone. But enough of them worked that the method spread and kept spreading until the people who remembered the winter of 86 and 87 began to speak of Whitfield shelters as if the name were obvious. Eli grew into a reliable hand. He never said much. He had always been quiet, but he worked steadily, and when Cora showed him something once, he remembered it forever. By the time he was 18, he could build a shelter from scratch without supervision. By 20, he had his own claim, proved up and stocked with cattle he had earned. Children came. 2 boys and a girl, born in the shack that Owen had finally finished siding, raised among cattle in shelters, and the constant work of keeping animals alive through seasons that wanted them dead. Cora did not forget what she had learned. She walked the pens in bad weather with her hand on the outer wall, checking where the wind had found a seam. She taught her children the same way Marit had taught her, through action, through demonstration, through the patient repetition of skills that could not be learned from description alone. And she never stopped watching what the wind was doing. Abel Crow came one more time. It was the winter of 1891, 5 years after the catastrophe that had launched everything. The cold was severe, not as severe as '86, but bad enough to test anyone who was not prepared. Crow arrived at Cora's place in the midst of a blowing storm, leading 2 cows that looked half dead. His face was white with cold, his hands shaking, his voice rough from the wind. "My shelter collapsed," he said. "The one I built. Last night, the frame couldn't hold the snow load." Cora looked at the cows. They were thin, shivering, coated with ice. They would die if they stayed outside much longer. "Bring them in," she said. Crow stared at her. "You'd let me." "Bring them in. We'll talk about the rest after they're warm." She helped him lead the cows into her largest shelter, positioning them near the center where the cattle's accumulated warmth was strongest. She brought straw and piled it around their bodies. She brought water that had been warming near the vent fire and let them drink. The cows survived, both of them. When the storm passed and Crow prepared to leave, he stood in the opening of the shelter and looked at the structure he had tried to replicate and failed. "I built it wrong," he said. "The frame, the crossbinding. I thought I understood, but I didn't." "You can learn." "Can I?" Crow's voice was bitter. "I've been trying to figure out how this works for 5 years. Every time I think I understand, something fails." Cora considered him. He was older now, grayer, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. The man who had sat on his horse and waited for her to fail was still there, somewhere inside. But he was buried under years of evidence that he had been wrong. "The problem isn't that you don't understand," she said. "The problem is that you're trying to understand from a distance. You watch, but you don't do. You think, but you don't feel." "What does that mean?" Cora pressed her palm against the inside wall of the shelter. The mud was cold damp, exactly as it should be. The wind outside was screaming, but inside, the air was still. "It means you have to put your hands on the work," she said, "not just once, every day, every storm, until you can feel what the structure is doing without thinking about it." Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pressed his own palm against the wall. "Cold damp," he said. "Yes. Not frozen. No, the cattle make heat. The structure keeps the wind from stealing it, but only if you build it right, and only if you maintain it, and only if you pay attention." Crow withdrew his hand. His expression was complicated, something like respect, something like defeat, something like the beginning of understanding. "I suppose I have a lot to learn," he said. "Everyone does. The question is whether you're willing to do the work." He did not answer. He simply gathered his cows and rode away into the snow. But he came back. A month later, then again in the spring, then regularly after that. He asked questions. He watched demonstrations. He put his hands on the work. And eventually, slowly, he learned. Cora Whitfield died in her sleep on a January night in 1915, 56 years old and tired in her bones. Owen had gone 5 years earlier, peacefully, holding her hand. Eli had taken over the operation, running it the way she had taught him, maintaining the shelters she had built, and building new ones when the herd expanded. Her children scattered across the territory and beyond, but they carried what she had taught them: the watching, the feeling, the patient attention to what the wind was doing. Some of them built shelters of their own, some of them taught others. The knowledge spread in ways she never saw and never needed to see. She was buried on the rise overlooking the lot where it had all started. The shelter she had built that first desperate autumn was long gone, replaced and rebuilt and expanded a dozen times. But the principle remained. The saplings bent into hoops, the woven brush laced across the ribs, the straw and mud skin blocking the wind, still air as half a blanket. She had lived long enough to see what she knew passed on. That was more than most people got. Return to that January night in 1887. Return to the blizzard that should have killed everything. The temperature had dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. The wind hit 60 miles an hour. Angus Vail, who had wintered cattle from Montana to Dakota for 18 seasons and buried 2 sons and a wife to the cold, had looked at Cora Whitfield's cattle lot and delivered his verdict. Keep them in that pen, and you'll hear them bawling under the snow by dawn. By dawn, there was sound in Cora Whitfield's pen, but it was not the panic Vail had promised. It was not the bawling of animals freezing to death in the open. It was cattle shifting in deep straw, steam pushing from a narrow vent, wood creaking as the frost hardened the mudskin outside. Across the flats, dead stock lay against broken fences and drifted wire. Inside the low, ugly shelter, every animal was still standing. Cora pressed her bare palm against the inner arch at first light. Outside, the wall was white with rime. Inside, it was only cold damp, holding what the wind had failed to steal. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the mud under her palm, feeling the warmth that should not have been possible. Then she went to feed her cattle, because there was work to do, and the winter was not over, and she had learned that the only way through was forward. The wind howled outside. The shelter held. And Cora Whitfield, who had built something impossible from saplings and straw and stubbornness, walked into the gray dawn to begin another day.